Welcome, everybody. Dr. Eric, again, thank you as always for taking the time. Joined with the Doctor's Corner with Dr. Eric of Primex Cellular Nutrition. And, if you guys have watched any of the prior episodes, we have a bunch of great resources at your disposal, not only on our side, Life of a Fighter, but I really wanted to share with Dr. Eric's side as well for your website. And obviously you can see in the background from the podcast to supplements to the clinic and all the treatments, as well as the website that we'll have in the details you guys can see below. We want to go live obviously too. So if you guys do have comments or questions while we're going through this, I'll try and monitor our posting page so we can stay in real time with you guys. And today we're going to be talking about first, it was a little bit inspiring. We were talking a little bit before we went live about UFC 253 and a little bit of the controversy around Israel Adesanya and what some are saying it looks like it could be either gynecomastia or asymmetrical version, or what's the other term that could be for where it's not gynecomastia, but it's like pseudo gynecomastia, I guess. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, the typical, you hear people talking about gynecomastia, which is an actual growth of breast tissue, which can occur in men and women, typically in men, which is abnormal. And then there's pseudo gynecomastia, which is actually excessive growth of fat tissue. So there's a difference there. One is more of the ducts, like you'd see, that's, when women think of them nursing, and then abnormal growth, which usually presents as a painful lump right under the nipple, whereas pseudo gynecomastia is more just an fat accumulation. So you get kind of just look like you got a boob. It's just fat accumulation. It can be here in the middle. It can be off to the side because the breast tissue goes up all the way up under the shoulder there. So that's kind of most guys. It's like the pseudo. People think, oh, I got gyno, and it's like, no, you just got some fat, dude. It's just,
Yeah, and also thank you for the wording correction. I always abbreviate things, and that's why it's always good to have a doctor here too to make sure you get the right technical terms before people start jumping down my throat like, you don't even know what you're talking about. You're not even saying it right. And that's honestly, we even said we don't know what Israel Adesanya is. We're just speculating at best to what potential things. So I thought that could be a nice inspiration to the real topic at hand of hormones, peptides, common myths and misconceptions, especially from what you're seeing on your end, Dr. Eric, whether it's your own personal clinic or when you talk to other doctors, your own team or other clients and people that you get to work with. And I thought it could be a fun topic because I feel like there is a lot of myths and misconceptions, whether it was even from my own experience as a young athlete, worried about, also not doing it. Well, a lot of people may not be doing it in the healthiest manner, whether they're working with a doctor or working with a clinic or working with a professional that knows what they're doing and just buying it from some guy at the gym and just taking whatever, and who knows what it is, and then having all these negative ramifications and side effects. So I wanted to kind of start with the original piece of UFC 250, Israel Adesanya, and some potential, again, not spend too much time on it because obviously we don't know, but if he's very adamant about saying it's not steroids, there's no PEDs, and he's not really sure what it could be. And I've heard other people talk about maybe it's an acute trauma, maybe got hit there really hard in sparring and causing inflammation, I guess. I was curious to see if there was any insight from your end that there's anything that jumps out at you. Obviously, you don't have all the details on the back end, so just we could briefly touch on it and then kind of jump into hormones and peptides and the myths and misconceptions.
Yeah, sure. I think, obviously in elite level athletes, there's always speculations and worries about PED use or using anything to kind of get an edge. And of course, it's done all the time, whether it's steroids or EPO, which boosts your red blood cell production, or extra dose of testosterone, or whatever. So of course, people always want to just make sure that somebody didn't win because they're taking XYZ. So of course they're going to jump on that. And then again, we don't know if he was doing that, but I think where that comes from is there have been a lot of guys, bodybuilders and professional athletes who have used steroids and even excessive doses of testosterone, but usually with the synthetic steroids, and either during a cycle or post-cycle, they can get some either gynecomastia or typically pseudo-gynecomastia, like we were talking about, to get some abnormal fat tissue growth. And that's because it kind of messes everything up. And we can get into that later, like what the complications, why they can be a bad thing if they're abused, but you see that all the time. But and typically it is bilateral with both sides. You'll see some fat accumulation on both sides, but it can be asymmetric because we're normally asymmetric creatures anyway, but sometimes it can be one bigger one than the other. So with him, who knows, it could, maybe he took a shot there and you actually could get some damage to the tissue, and almost like a lipodystrophy or just a contusion to the soft tissues, and cause some abnormal swelling and growth, or he had a tiny tear in the pec muscle, a very tiny one, and caused some fluid accumulation. Who knows, if he didn't have it before, it just happened during the fight, it's probably related to that. But Maybe it was just something that was slightly there and it was brought out to be more prominent due to an injury during the fight or something like that. But, who knows? We'll find out. I'm assuming they're going to test him for all kinds of things, medical as well as PED use. So that'd be interesting to see what happens.
Yeah, and to your point, like you said, this hasn't been something that he's had a track record of, or like all of a sudden there's also a massive gain in size or change in body composition or anything like that would maybe potentially be some potential flag. So we were even saying this before, like he said that he's going to do multiple blood work tests, MRI scans, trying to figure out what the issue is. And
right.
I guess I was just curious to touch on that, and we can kind of springboard into, like you're saying, talking about, hormones and peptides, and obviously they're two different things. But a lot of the myths and misconceptions that circle around those things, and maybe some of the most common that you hear that are probably the most blatant that you wanted to maybe start with, and we can dig into some of the fun pieces from there.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk about an hour on this, but I think, I see a lot of men and women for hormone imbalances and everything from cortisol and insulin to testosterone and estrogen, to thyroid, everything. But I'd say the myths, the things that I hear about the most frequent ones have to do with probably testosterone and estrogen. Men and women will have concerns, either things they've read online or there's something their doctor has said, which unfortunately is not very true. Everything in the FDA, if you read, there's a big book called the PDR, the Physician's Desk Reference. It's like this thick, right? And anytime anything is reported as even a possibility of a side effect, it has to get listed. Like if you pull up go to your pharmacy, get a thing for Motrin, the list of possible side effects is like this long because somebody thought maybe they had this. And even if they didn't, they have to list it. Same thing with testosterone. So you'll see a little warning in there. Testosterone may cause blood clots, strokes, and heart attacks. They have it in there. Because if you actually look at what happened, it was very, very dubious and very questionable. They've done hundreds of studies since then, interventional studies, meaning here's a guy with this condition without anything, here's a guy with this condition, and they give him testosterone. What happens? And almost in every case, testosterone actually improves heart function, improves your body's ability to pump oxygen with the heart, improves your blood pressure, lowers inflammation, improves cardiovascular health. So the studies clearly show it helps, but that's something I'll hear from guys like, well, I heard that it can cause heart problems, or I heard it can jack up my blood pressure. Of course, prostate cancer is another one, same kind of thing. Every trial has shown that it does not affect your prostate cancer risk. If anything, it helps the guys with lower testosterone levels actually have more aggressive cancers when they do get it, and a worse prognosis in the end. So if anything, it's the other way around. The higher, the better. So those are the big ones: prostate and heart. Women are concerned about, well, I've heard that it can, it's going to turn me into a guy, or I'm going to grow hair everywhere, or lose my hair, or whatever. And yeah, some women are more susceptible to androgens, meaning like testosterone. They can get a little bit of hair growth, or maybe a little bit of acne breakouts, or some oily skin, but very mild and easily controlled. And if they're on appropriate doses, I rarely see. Every now and then I see it, but not very commonly. But those are, I think my guys are mostly concerned about prostate, heart, and then of course the other one is hair. Women are more concerned about abnormal hair growth or turning into a guy, which it's not going to happen, right? So it just doesn't happen. We're giving them much lower doses than men. So that's probably the other big one, is the hair. People are like, oh, my hair is going to fall out. And once again, studies have shown it's really not the case. It's mostly genetically determined. If you're predisposed to having hair loss genetically, it runs in the family, et cetera, and you go on testosterone, could that speed it up a little bit? Possibly. It's only like a 1 or 2% chance or change, because it might accelerate a little bit, especially if you're doing moderate doses. It could. But again, if you're a guy that has nothing in his genetic line of everybody in your family's got a thick set of hair, you take testosterone, you're not gonna go bald. It's just not gonna happen. So those are probably the biggest myths I see. And then of course, too, the other one is a lot of people still kind of get a concern because of PEDs, right? Because of steroids, they get them mixed up. Well, like, that's a steroid. What's gonna happen? I'm gonna drop dead, or I'm gonna have all these heart problems and things. And again, I think a lot of it, or I'm gonna get thick blood, right? I got to get my blood counts checked, so I'm gonna get thick blood and have a stroke. Well, that kind of got a bad myth because of unfortunately back in 70s, 80s, and so a lot of the bodybuilders were doing massive doses of testosterone, and they did get some elevation in their red blood cell counts, and they had some of these other unusual side effects, but they were doing grams of testosterone. Your average Joe is just not even getting anywhere near that. So again, if you're being treated appropriately, I just never see it. So those are probably the biggest ones I see: testosterone, and we could talk about estrogen if you want to, but in terms of testosterone, steroid stuff, that's probably the most common.
Yeah, and just even to pause on that, and that's something I wanted to highlight, maybe pull out for a second, is that idea of, like you said, if we're in a certain dynamic or environment of massive, potentially, I guess, overdosing, I don't know if that's an appropriate term, or just having larger increments coming in versus what might be with an actual professional, with a doctor, with someone that is looking at blood work and making an actual informed decision based on what they're seeing with an ultimate end result in mind that's balanced in health, not like I want to be as big and as strong as possible, which is even maybe that's a whole nother category, which I don't think there's, from my perspective, if everyone's on the same page, like, hey, we're all on board with getting as big, as strong as possible, we all agree and say that's what we want to do, okay, cool. I think when it comes to fighting or maybe other combative sports, or where you're interacting with another individual and their health becomes on the line because you've now increased the amount of force you can produce, that's also another potentially interesting dynamic that I don't necessarily agree with. But to your point, if they are like treating with a doctor and in that dynamic and in that environment, I feel like that's a really important piece to pull out. And to your point also with estrogen, I'd love to hear some of the other side of it on with estrogen, some of the misconceptions or myths, or kind of just circulated information that can be broken down a bit.
Yeah, estrogen's a big one too. Yeah, men and women. Women were on estrogen for decades and decades until a study came out in 2001 called the WHI, and it showed some potential increase in strokes and breast cancer and Alzheimer's. But it turned out, in reviewing it later, it was kind of a shitty study. And once you really dissected it, it really wasn't the case. And if you're on the synthetic hormones, yeah, like Premarin and Prempro, but if you're on a bioidentical hormone like estradiol, progesterone, everything drops. Lowers your risk of heart disease, lowers your risk of breast cancer, lowers your risk of Alzheimer's. It's all positive. They've done so many studies, but unfortunately, you get what's called a confirmation bias. When people learn one study, you see it, something in the newspaper that, whatever, if this happens, you have a hard time getting that out of your head if you hear something contradictory. Look at the news today. If you read something and it's huge and they make a big to-do about it, and it's propagated for months at a time, then all of a sudden years later, like, well, that wasn't true. It's going to take you a while to change your mind. Look what happened back in the 80s. We used to all be like low fat, right? Fat's bad. So everybody's eating low fat and eating all this carbs and processed foods, and for literally a couple decades until we finally righted the ship. And now what's everybody doing? Keto, right? Everybody's doing fat, loading up the fat, opposite. But it took decades to fix that. So same thing with estrogen. It's taking time, but it's people are catching on that if you do bioidentical the right way, massively beneficial. And with men, huge thing, and you're probably familiar with this too. A lot of the bodybuilders and powerlifting community, et cetera, for years and years, they're like, oh my God, you got to get your testosterone. You got to drop that. You got to block that estrogen, man. You got to take a what they call an aromatase inhibitor to block the conversion of testosterone to estrogen. And so guys would come in all the time, like, man, like we were talking about that was one of the biggest things. They'd say, oh, doc, I got gyno, man. I got gyno. And they were saying, they didn't, but they were saying that so they could get their anastrozole. But now we realize that's a bad thing. You do not want to block your estrogen. A lot of benefits of testosterone actually come from the estrogen. The heart protection, the increased libido, the fat loss actually comes from a lot from the estrogen as well as the testosterone. Other benefits too. And they've clearly shown studies, guys on testosterone plus an anastrozole where you block the estrogen, then you see what happens. And guys who get it blocked, they get a drop in libido. They get erectile issues, they get fat, they get visceral fat, they get fat under the skin, they get osteoporosis, and the list goes on. I mean, it's been proven. And now I think now everybody's like, oh yeah, you're right, don't block it. But there's still some hardcore people out there who don't believe that. But, look at all the, speaking to your athletic group here, I mean, they're familiar with, look how many pro bodybuilders and athletes have died. These guys that are healthy, endurance athletes and especially bodybuilders, because a lot of these guys, unfortunately, I know a couple in particular, and I know a physician who is this way too, that they did that. They blocked their estrogen for decades, and all of a sudden they are having heart attacks and all these problems. And then later they realize, oh shit, that's why they blocked the estrogen. That's why women are protected. They live longer. They have more estrogen than men longer in life. So I think more and more people are finally catching on to this, but once again, it's taken a while to kind of bust that myth. And every now and then on the forums or someone will message me on Instagram still talking about estrogen, like, man, I don't know. I think that's a bunch of BS and you got to block it. And I'm like, no. So anyway.
And I think to your point, like, this is a very simplified, maybe oversimplified version that I always ask myself or challenge people to look at is like, do you think your body either produces it, has receptors for it, or has that in your environment by accident.
Right.
For the most part, like obviously I'm not going to say there might be certain dynamics that maybe there's over responses to it, or there's maybe some hereditary dysfunction or any kind of variability there. But obviously, even like cortisol, like I think that's another one. I've talked about cortisol on a very basic level of it's associated with stress, but again, there's value in it to a certain dynamic in your body. Your body needs all the different, whether it's hormones or receptors or all the different pieces. It's supposed to work homeostasis and harmony and have a role that it plays. So I think that's always something I was curious to kind of bounce off of you too, in that thought process, to see like, hey, it's not there by accident, right? We want a certain amount and have a function and a role in it. So I was just kind of curious to see your thoughts there.
No, and you're right. That's a great one too. Cortisol, same thing. A lot of people think, people have heard so much about that it's bad, it's the stress hormone. This is true when it's chronically elevated, but again, like you said, you need it for certain things. It's actually very beneficial to get these acute bursts of cortisol, especially, again, speaking of guys and gals working out, say you work out fast in the morning, you're going to get that cortisol spike. That's great because that's going to help you burn off that fat, give you that boost of energy, use glucose as fuel. And then after workout, you want it to drop and you want to recover. But these people that have burned the candle both ends, they're not sleeping, they're eating crappy, they're just working out all the time. Their levels, after a while, if it's chronically elevated, that's when you get the problems. But it's actually a good play. You need cortisol. We couldn't live without cortisol. It's massively important. So it often gets maligned. Same with insulin too. Insulin's like, it's evil. It's evil. But
read my mind.
Insulin resistance, right? That's a bad thing because it leads to diabetes. But once you, like you said, and very, very great catch on your point, because our bodies are freaking smart. They're way smarter than we are. It knows everything's there for a reason. And oftentimes we get insulin resistant for a reason. Perhaps we don't need that glucose, that sugar in the cell right now. So it's blocking entry, leaving it in the blood because it senses there's something going on. For example, infections, a lot of infections, bacteria, viruses, they use sugar to grow. So you might be harboring a chronic or lingering infection. If you're shoving all that insulin into the cells, then the glucose is going to come rushing in. Normally that's what happens after you eat, right? You eat a meal, glucose goes up, your insulin rises to take that fuel and shuttle it into your cells to use it as fuel. That's one of its jobs. But if you're harboring an infection, the body is smart. It wants to starve those bacteria, those viruses of glucose. So it's going to make you insulin resistant. So you can't absorb it. And you're thinking, so once again, you have to look at the whole picture. It's not a cookie cutter thing. It's very complex. A lot of these people, throwing protocols out, do this, do that. Well, you don't, if you don't know the whole spectrum from the medical side, then you're not, there's more to it. It's way more complex. So that's kind of a new paradigm. People are like, well, there's reason to become insulin resistant. People are like, what do you mean? It's always bad, isn't it? No, not always. So that's just one example.
Yeah, I think that's a great point too. And honestly, speaking to the point of and that's sometimes I think maybe where other health professionals or fitness professionals go beyond their scope of practice. And that's something as I've been more and more involved in the health and fitness and medical world is realizing what my scope of practice is, how to stay within that. Cause I've had a lot of clients like, well, Mike, you sound like you know all this stuff. Like I'd rather talk to you than my primary care physician, my general practitioner or whatever. Like, listen, that all well sounds good, but by no means is that within my wheelhouse or scope. And maybe a younger version of myself would be happy to answer questions in a very uninformed way. So for all those other professionals out there that may be young and want to answer questions, it's great to have knowledge, but still stay within that scope of practice too.
Absolutely. Well said.
So I want to piggyback that, looking at hormones in a very similar vein, but also somewhat, different too, pivoting to peptides. I was curious to see, maybe there's also not as much, maybe myth or misconception. I'm curious because I've even become newly exposed to peptides probably in the last 6 to 12 months, more so than just understanding short chain amino acids, but the role and the impact they have. And maybe some of the myths and misconceptions that you may hear on your end that come from it. Obviously, maybe they'll also tie into hormones, but I don't know if there's something different you hear or related to that kind of jumps out at you.
Yeah, I think it is newer, so there's not quite as many myths, but I think it's still a newer science and it's changing all the time. And there's not as many longer term studies on some of these. Some of these there have been, especially in Russia and some other countries, they've been using peptides for decades. So I think, probably the most common one is with the growth hormone secretagogues. These are the ones that stimulate your body to make more of its own natural growth hormone in a natural pattern. Highly beneficial, can do many awesome things to your body in a beneficial way. Unlike growth hormone, which is when you're actually just giving yourself growth hormone, it gives you these artificial spikes and it can raise it too high or at the wrong times. Whereas these secretagogues, basically you take them at night typically, because that's when your body normally makes growth hormone, and it's normally making these spikes of growth hormone during the night. Well, all it's doing is augmenting those normal spikes. It's not going way super high. It's not going in the middle of the day at the wrong time of the day. So there's a lot of beneficial effects. So, but I think growth hormone in IGF-1, which it produces, your liver produces it to shuttle that growth hormone into your body. People think, oh my gosh, the biggest thing is it's going to cause cancer, right? Something like that. And fortunately, it's never really been proven. They've actually given it to a lot of people who even had cancer and they've done fine. Yeah, if you have a cancer, you don't want to take it. But if you're a healthy person and you don't have cancer, it's totally fine, totally safe to take. Once again, as with everything, the dose, the dose is the poison, right? If too much of anything is a bad thing. You can drink too much water and it can kill you. But yeah, if you're really spiking up your growth hormone, your IGF-1, it may not be a great thing. But again, if you're doing it properly, now there's never been any issues even with growth hormone of causing problems or causing cancer per se. But again, as long as you're doing it properly. So that's probably the most common one. A lot of the newer one, the other ones, there's not as many myths out there just because I don't think a lot of people know about it as of yet. But a lot of them, the good thing is the other part of it is that a lot of them are very safe because they're very specific and selective. Like for example, one we talked about with you was BPC-157. It's kind of the healing peptide, right? It's actually, nobody really knows, but it's basically a signaling peptide. It basically signals or tells cells and enzymes and proteins to do things. It doesn't have a direct action on the cells. It's almost like the conductor. It kind of makes things happen. So, and it's extremely safe. And that one's been studied for a long time, and they've done, lots and lots of studies on it. Even people taking it chronically have had no issues, no reported side effects, no reported adverse outcomes or anything, which is unusual. Most medications, there's always going to be something, but at least to my knowledge, at least right now in October 2020, I haven't heard of any yet. So
yeah, I think that's a great point too. With maybe as people hear about it more, maybe myths will be like created, or there'll be something that always comes up from it. And that also, I'm curious to see, and just like where my mind immediately goes is when you talked about whether it's growth hormone or any variation of that, and also playing with our maybe like tying into circadian rhythm, and then also exogenous versus endogenous, or any variation of there, and how that maybe sometimes plays a role in the misconception of if it's some foreign, entity, or the impact it's having and not being measured and feeding into the myth versus being something that's naturally occurring, or that is, like you said, communicating with your cells or with your body and signaling to, hey, let's go to this site, or to naturally produce this, and then not have, because and obviously I'd love to hear your thoughts to speak to this more, but we introduce whether it's whatever the hormone or variable is, and maybe it goes beyond just hormones, but any kind of foreign entity or something to our body, there's going to be impact, right? A ripple effect of the rest of the body being able to deal with that. And maybe when it's exogenously introduced, the drastic swing or a pendulum swing of it to compensate is potentially what maybe leads to those myths. Or like sometimes I'm curious, like maybe sometimes where they come from.
Yeah, you're right. And I think it's like that with anything, right? Most of the things that, we recommend are bioidentical. So for example, estradiol or the testosterone or the growth hormone secretagogues, they're basically mimicking, and they molecularly chemical level exactly like the ones that our body makes. So that's why they're called bioidentical, as opposed to synthetic versions like Premarin or Prempra, which is the synthetic estrogen that women are on for a long time. It actually is only maybe 30%, or I can't remember the exact number, but maybe 20 to 30% of estradiol, and the rest of it's like these synthetic estrogens, some of which was derived from horse urine. So very powerful, synthetic, and they're chemical, kind of like steroids, right? You take, your Stanozol or Anavar and all these other Winstrol, all these other ones, they're synthetic. They're not like anything made in our human body. So it is foreign. It's a foreign thing, but most medications are foreign, right? You take your Pepcid or your Prozac or whatever, they can do things in the body naturally, but they themselves are a foreign compound. We don't make Prozac in our brain, you know what I mean? So that's the danger. And again, with everything, a lot of them are very safe as long as you're dosing it properly. But once again, the dose determines its effect. Too much of anything is not a good thing. So like we were talking about earlier, if you're taking massive doses of even a bioidentical hormone like testosterone, there can be some adverse effects. But it's that way with supplements, for example. We, of course, for example, B vitamins are, we use them for numerous chemical reactions in our body. But if you're slamming down all these B vitamins, 99% of the time it's going to be fine. But if you have a genetic abnormality where you can't process, you hear a lot about like MTHFR is kind of a big one that you hear about, where they can't convert folic acid into folate, into the actual usable form of folate. So if you're slamming a bunch of it, it's not going down the proper pathway, and it can back up and cause some problems. So even something as innocuous or you think as safe as a B vitamin, right? What harm can that do? Well, again, based on your genetics and lifestyle, it could cause some problems. Same thing, we're finding out, vitamin E, right? Vitamin E is a great antioxidant. Well, as I'm starting to do a lot of things with genetic testing and some genetic precision medicine. There's actually some genetic polymorphisms or changes in your gene structure that can indicate, for example, if you're better at tolerating fat, or if you're more of a strength athlete versus endurance athlete, or all these different variations. But vitamin E, for example, some people shouldn't take it based on their genetics. They actually may, when they process that vitamin E, it actually may turn into more of an inflammatory compound as opposed to an antioxidant. So based on your genetic profile, you might not want to take vitamin E. So again, it gets pretty deep, right? So we're, with some of the new protocols I'm instituting with my patients, we're getting into genetics, we're getting in deep dive into the lifestyle and the hormones and all. It's not just, oh, how do you feel? Let's look at a couple labs and let's put you on all this stuff. Well, now we're digging deeper, and now we're seeing why a lot of people have these weird reactions. You're like, well, I'm giving you this, it should do X, but it's doing the opposite. Why the hell is that? Now we're kind of figuring out why. Some of it's genetics, some of it's, your lifestyle, stress and sleep and all the different. So there's definitely a lot more to it. But yeah, those are some examples for sure of, like you said, the natural form versus synthetic form. But both can be good, both can be bad, depending on how it's dosed and what else you've got going on that you need to look into.
Yeah, and also, like you said, working with a doctor or with a professional and having it being monitored, and someone that's educated in that field. And that's why I love having you come on and being able to take the time, so that when people ask these questions, and again, it falls outside of my scope, or maybe you're working with another coach or another fitness professional, I think that it's important to have a coach or a fitness professional that you work with that realizes what is their scope of practice and not trying to address something that goes beyond that. And even if it's when, I have physical therapists that I also trust that I have to refer out to or default to, or other, even specialists in dietetics, whether it's, talking about maybe a very specific condition. That I had a recent client, I won't expose too much of the details there to get into it, but I was like, honestly, that's really something I'd want you to see a specialist for, in whether clinical nutrition or dietetics, to address that specifically, because it could be autoimmune related or relating and impacting your immune. And it could be you follow a protocol that would typically work, but one of those foods has an adverse response, and then it changes the bacteria, the gut flora, and we have a completely different response, and it turns into where it's attacking your body instead of helping your body. And then I was curious too, to just kind of hear the idea of not just looking at, whether we talk about from a supplement standpoint, the potential, polymorphism or adaptations, but even the toxicity levels of what you're like a vitamin C. The vitamin C always kind of jumps out at me, because not that it's, and when we say toxicity levels, I don't mean that maybe you're going to potentially die, but there, that threshold of when you have too much, there's an adverse response of that always, without, which is being blunt, of vitamin C associated with potentially diarrhea or kind of, digestional issues. And that's just one I always give it as an example, because it's something as harm, like you said, with even a B vitamin or vitamin C or vitamin E. It seems like, hey, how can it hurt me? Can there really be too much of it? But knowing that there can be potentially too much and the adverse response, and then, oh, well, maybe that explains over here why I feel this way, because I'm taking too much of this, and to look at that. So
yeah. Absolutely. No, vitamin C is a good example. I mean, fortunately, it is quite safe. It's water soluble like the B vitamins, but like you said, some people, if you take so much, you can get some GI upset and some diarrhea. That's why a lot of times in detox protocols, they'll have you take as much until you figure out where your threshold is. When you start crapping your brains out, that's your limit, right? So, and that's what it's for. So, fortunately, for the most part, it's pretty well tolerated, unless there's some people that have a genetic abnormality called a G6pd Deficiency, and those are people you have to be careful. You'll typically, they'll know, or you test them for that. But that's another example. I mentioned the vitamin E, the B vitamins, any supplement, there's always potential, same with herbal supplements, depending if you never know if somebody's gonna have an allergy or some other weird adverse reaction based on their genetics, things like that. So, once again, as with everything, I always tell people, say, let's, dig in your lifestyle, maybe look at your genetics and start low and work your way up to something. You don't slam someone with 10 grams of vitamin C all at once. Start with a gram and see how they do, and then kind of work your way up. Same with thyroid hormones or testosterone. You kind of start at a reasonable dose, and you can always give more, but you can't take it away once it's given. So you have to be careful with that.
100%. And that's, I kind of want to wrap it up on that point, because I think there's a lot of value just from that pieces that we'll kind of unpack. And before we go, I wanted to just kind of remind everybody again, not only, you know, all the great stuff we have with Life of Fight and just focusing on, but I also wanted to flip it to you, Dr. Eric, and everything you have going on, whether it's your podcast, again, an amazing, not only opportunity to work with you and your clinics, and because of everything we have going on right now in the world, but also supplement line and the great free content you have on your website, as well as some of the paid programs, content, and things that you can use there. I just wanted to kick that and remind everybody. We'll have that below. But is there anything else that we might have missed that I also wanted to make sure that we just remind everybody of?
Yeah, no, that's awesome. Thank you. Appreciate you having me on. It's always fun, always a good time. Yeah, people, you know, reach out if any of your followers wants to ask me a question. I'm always available online. You can go to my website, drericprimex.com. I've got a lot of freebies on there, and my YouTube channel has a ton of videos, all free. And same with Instagram. I post everything on there, Dr. Eric Primex. And under the tagline is Dr. Eric, the fitness physician. Facebook, Primex Cellular Nutrition and Fitness. So if you look up Dr. Eric Primex, you can typically find me out there. But yeah, happy to answer any questions if anybody has any now or down the road. Or I do consultations, and like you said, I do telehealth, telemedicine consultations anywhere with everything's kind of going virtual nowadays. So I've got a lot of patients out of state. So people have questions or they want to sign up. I've got some coaching programs if they want to work with me with their nutrition. I mean, you know, nutrition or hormone optimization, overall health optimization. I can take you on and help you at any time, anybody, anywhere.
Beautiful. We appreciate it. Thank you, guys. Thank you, Dr. Eric, as always. And again, we're going to be coming to you guys every month with the Doctor's Corner. So if, like you said, you have questions, not only reach out to Dr. Eric, but you can let us know. We can try and address them on a future episode. And hope you guys enjoy the weekend.